Hello everyone, welcome to the Rift. Today, it's that time of the format again. We're doing a tier list. That's right, it's time to get yelled at in the comments because I put someone's favorite deck in bottom tier. I actually think this format is looking surprisingly diverse and surprisingly decent, despite the initial doom and gloom about Draven taking over everything. I still think he's an incredibly strong deck, but there are definitely a lot of other decks that can compete with what he's trying to do and can be built to either directly counter him or contend with him while also being a very strong deck in the format alongside him. As is the case with any tier list or anything you see online, take what you see here with a little bit of grain of salt. This tier list is constructed based on data mainly from overseas regionals in China, as well as online tournaments outside of China, and my own personal testing experience and opinions as well. I would encourage you to take this tier list more as a guideline to begin your own testing for the format and not as a 100% factual set in stone list. Tier lists can change and things can shift around as formats evolve and people adapt to certain strategies trying to counter each other and counter those counters and back and forth and such. So take this list as a guideline and not 100% facts. Alright, we've got a lot to talk about today, so let's jump into it. But first, if you're enjoying the content, then make sure that you like the video and feel free to smash that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support the channel even further, I have a link to my Patreon in the video description. Also, I have channel memberships now. They're just $1 and you get these nice badges next to your name whenever you comment or chat in live streams. Thank you to everybody who supports the channel, even just by watching videos. I really appreciate it. Alright, back to the video. First up, we've got the top tier decks, the best decks in the game, what I think are the strongest picks available to play, and what will give you the best odds of topping and doing well in general at big events. These decks are what define the format and are decks that you should probably have a plan to try and contend with or directly counter if you're going to bigger events. First up, we've got Draven, the boogeyman, the man, the myth, the legend himself. Look at that smile, man. That's a handsome fella. This is the deck that I'm playing this format and my personal pick for the best deck in the format. I think this is the best legend in the game right now. Just getting to draw a bunch of cards whenever you do essentially nothing out of the ordinary. You just play the game and you get rewarded for playing the game with free card draw. If that doesn't sound good to you, I don't know what you're smoking, but it sounds pretty good to me. I think red-purple right now is the best color combo in the game. Purple is the best utility and defensive color we have, and red is the best offensive color and the best unit color, so there's really nothing that this deck is lacking. It's got the best units, it's got the best draw power, it's got the best utility, it's got the best defensive cards. I think it is just the best deck in the deck to beat this format, but it really isn't that much better than everything else in this top tier here. And there are even some people saying that it's not the best deck, which you could potentially argue, but for now I'm gonna say it is. Next up, I've got Ezreal, which some people argue is actually the best deck and it's better than Draven, which is arguable, I would say, but for now, I don't think the results are there to really prove that in any capacity. This is a very different deck compared to Draven. It's more control-esque, whereas Draven is definitely mid-range. You're going to be using stuff like Singularity, which is the best control tool in the format right now. Blowing up two of Draven's units is just really good value. It also draws a card when you use it, so that's even more value on top of what it already does. Singularity plus Stupefy can kill pretty much anything Draven can put onto the board. Reaching up to that 7 threshold is really good because some of his units do reach 7. Getting to 2-for-1 people with stuff like Singularity is very strong, while also drawing a card on top of that. It's even more card advantage. You can lock down your opponent's board with this deck and then rip whatever they have remaining from their hand with something like Mind Splitter. You also have an insanely powerful Chosen Champion. Purple Ezreal is just cracked beyond belief. That card is insane. Pair it with Scrap Heap to draw 3 cards, pair it with Cold Shot and something like a gold token to draw cards for free. This deck is absolutely a card draw machine. You draw so many cards, even without engaging in combat, like Draven has to. Yeah, this deck is just insanely good. I think it's the best control-leaning deck in the format right now. Next up, we've got Aurelia. This deck is quite tricky to play and play against. It's very different than what we've seen in the game so far. It's a very very protect the president Voltron style of deck. You basically just have green Aurelia or Stellacorn and throw a bunch of spells on them. Yeah, if you really know what you're doing with this deck and your opponent isn't that well versed in playing against it, you can kind of just dog walk them. And even if they are experienced, it's still a very strong deck. Green Aurelia is kind of a war crime. She's an insane unit, gets to ridiculously high might totals for not really that much investment, and your signature spell is arguably one of the best in the game, if not the best. That card is also crazy. Yeah, she has a good color combo as well. Green and purple complement her playstyle excellently. Green has the best pump spells in the game, both offensively and defensively, and that's exactly what you want in this deck. And purple has crazy utility and defensive power, and you can draw a billion cards with Stellacorn. This deck is really fun to play. It's insanely strong, definitely one of the best decks in the game right now. Next up, I've got Annie, and this deck is also insanely strong yet again. It's arguably the best deck in the format in Origins, especially with the Kaisa nerf, with her reflexive triggers getting removed, and I think she's also very strong in this format. Hard Bargain is just such an insane card for this deck. Getting a counterspell that you can play essentially for free is very good. It really helps you deal with some of the stuff that Control is trying to do, like singularities and such. Yeah, there's a lot of ways you can play this deck. You can play the very fast and aggressive, more tempo-focused builds that we saw last format. You can also play the Wombo combo builds, where you just vomit out a ton of big units like Rasa and Ram on one turn, just put down like 20 plus might onto the board out of nowhere while drawing a billion cards with the purple Ezreal and Scrap Heap combo. I think both decks are pretty strong. I think the more fast and aggressive build is probably going to be better. Going second and slamming down a sneaky deckhand is very strong, especially when you can protect it with 2 free energy. That's insanely strong. It's crazy fast point generation. And going first and slamming down a sneaky deckhand with an obelisk in play is essentially uncontestable. You essentially just win the game if you do that. You're starting the game with just 2 points ahead of your opponent for not really any investment, and there's not really any way your opponent can punish you besides really niche stuff, which you can have answers for because, again, you get 2 free energy to try and defend your play with. Yeah, this deck is still extremely strong. I think it's going to do very well. The color combo is, again, I think the best in the game. Red and purple complement each other very nicely. Red's got insane units and aggressive pushing power. Purple has insane utility, draw power, and defensive play. So yeah, I think Annie's still very good. In the next tier, we've got decks that I think are very good. Definitely solid picks this format, both at local and going into bigger tournaments. I think you can do very well with these decks. They all definitely can top and probably get even further if you're good. Some of these decks even, I think you could argue, could be up in tier 1. I just really didn't want to throw like 6 decks up in tier 1. I think that's probably too many for what the format is realistically going to look like. But yeah, I think you can make arguments for both Kaisa and Fiora to put them up in tier 1. I just didn't for this list because I don't really think they're as strong as the decks above them. They're both definitely great picks in this format, and they're both definitely pretty good, but Kaisa really doesn't have that great of a win rate or conversion. And Fiora, I think, might have some problems too that really keep them out of the top tier discussion. So let's start off with Kaisa. I've seen quite a lot of people put her up in the top tier, tier 1, and I really don't agree with that sentiment. While she is very strong, the numbers that she's been putting up in China really don't reflect that. I mean, she's doing perfectly fine. She's definitely a good deck. I just think there are like 4 or maybe even 5 or 6 decks that are just better than she is. She's another control deck in this format with access to a lot more control tools than Ezreal has, but she doesn't get to draw cards for free like Ezreal does with his Legend and his Chosen Champ and the Scrap Heap combo. If you even choose to play that, I don't really think he needs to draw that many cards. Yeah, I think some of the smaller removal spells that were very strong last format lose a lot this format, specifically because of stuff like Aurelia being relevant and Ezreal not really caring about his units that much, and Draven having stuff like Spinning Axe that can just completely stop your spells entirely. I don't really think cheap removal spells are nearly as good as they were last format, so I think you're going to be relying a lot more on your bigger, heavier hitting removal spells like Singularity, like Falling Star, like Piercing Light. They're still fine cards, they just lose out on their effectiveness. But but what you've lost in cheap removal spell potency you make up for with Piercing Light, which is a very strong card. Yeah, I think Kaisa is still definitely a solid deck. She's still definitely pretty strong, but I think she has just been slightly edged out of the top tier. Next up is Fiora, a deck that I think is also pretty strong. Her legend effect is pretty good. Just getting free runes is nice, and you really don't have to work that hard for that effect. All three of her chosen champion options are also pretty good, but the best part of her kit is her spell. Riposte is absolutely disgusting. This card is crazy. It's literally a cheaper wind wall that is also better because it's also a pump spell. Sometimes for a crazy amount of might that can just win the game. This is probably the best signature card in the game, if not top 3. It is just absolutely insane how efficient this is. If your opponent sequences things wrong, they could just end up losing because now your board is just too big to contest because they tried to play a spell before going into combat. And even if they play a spell during combat, they could still just lose because this card counters their spell and makes your guy bigger. So now they need even more stuff to be able to win that fight. Yeah, this card is absolutely insane. Punch First as well is just a disgusting card. +5 for 1 energy is stupid. And you also have a bunch of other cards that are great. Orange Set is fantastic for this deck specifically. Sabotage is crazy. Hidden Blade is always very good. Yellow and orange as a color combo gives you a pretty decent suite of tech options to play into the format depending on your matchup. Salvage is great. Sabotage, Unyielding Spirit, all good options. This deck just has a ton of great cards in it and some really good champion specific effects as well. What I think is holding this deck back the most is its draw power. You really don't have much in this deck. There's only like a couple of options for you to be able to draw cards, and they're all not amazing. Probably the best combo is Unsung Hero and BF Sword, but that's a 2-card combo, so you're definitely not seeing it every game. Yeah, despite the draw power issues, I think this deck is still very good. It has some crazy efficient cards in it. Punch First and Riposte are just absolutely insane cards. Next up, we've got 2 decks that I'm going to talk about at the same time because they're pretty similar. We've got Victor and Lux, both blue-yellow hard control decks. They really don't do anything besides just blow up the opponent's board and then do it again and then do it again until your opponent runs out of units and they can't play. Victor makes tokens, so he doesn't actually have to play any units in his deck, which means he could just focus entirely on spells to be able to control whatever the opponent's trying to do. And Lux lets you draw some cards to offset the fact that you do have to actually put some units into your deck. I think they're both pretty solid control options if you like playing control decks, just blowing up the board over and over again, killing everything your opponent tries to play. These decks are definitely for you. I think they're pretty solid picks to this format. Victor is also an insanely cheap deck to build, so it's probably the best budget option on this list. All right, next up we've got Sivir. I think this is a pretty strong deck in this format. Orange and purple is quite an excellent color combo, especially for this deck, which is trying to maximize playing the Ezreal and Rasa engine, just trying to put a bunch of cards in your trash with Ezreal and cheap cantrips like Stack Deck and Called Shot to then play a Rasa basically for free later on in the game, potentially multiple Rasas. That's always a crazy play to make. And you've got good orange stuff to do as well, like playing Punch First, and you've got cards like Sabotage to really rip apart your opponent's hand. You can play Sabotage comboed with Fizz to play it again to rip 2 cards. That's pretty crazy. And a lot of your power costs in this deck are going to be mitigated by your legend effect, giving you essentially just free temporary seals over the course of a game. I think this is a pretty strong mid-rangey kind of combo-y deck. It's got a lot of good stuff going for it, but I think it's a pretty difficult deck to play, and it's really not that represented. It really doesn't have that many results, so it could be much better than this. I don't really think it's any worse than this. I just think it's difficult and underplayed, so it's probably going to be underrepresented. Definitely a very strong and very fun pick for this format, but you do really have to know what you're doing when you play this deck. There's a lot of discarding and sequencing, and if you discard or sequence something wrong, you could end up just not really being able to recover the position. All right, next up is Lucian or Lucian. I don't really know how to say it. Kadril calls him Lucian, so that's what I'll say. Yeah, I think this deck is pretty strong. It's pretty fast, and it can definitely catch you off guard just how fast it can be sometimes. The signature spell is crazy. A lot of the time, it's just a better Ride the Wind, which is nuts. Yeah, I think his color combo is okay. He's got a lot of pretty good cards in the deck, but nothing insane besides his signature. He's got access to punch first as well. I think this deck not having access to purple makes it lack a little bit in terms of defense. It's definitely good at attacking, but defending it can sometimes feel a little bit weak. This is not really a color combo that defends, except when it has specifically punch first, and your legend and champion package don't really help you with that. Your legend is just for attacking. It's kind of meh. It's a pretty weak legend effect, I'd say. Just +1 only when you're equipped, only when you're attacking. Yeah, it's not the best thing ever. Relentless Pursuit is an action, so you can kind of dodge out of combat if you're gonna lose it and score extra points, which is nuts. And I think his orange champion unit is pretty good, and it's quite a nice effect. It can get into a battlefield and get out immediately by itself, or gank over to another battlefield if it gets ganking. It's a pretty good card. But yeah, I think of these two higher tiers up here, this is probably the weakest legend that we have. The deck is still pretty strong, I'd say, though. It's a very fast, very aggressive aggro deck, loves attacking, so if you like that playstyle, you're really gonna like this deck. It will definitely catch people off guard with how fast and how aggressive this deck is. And no, I don't think the gimmicky combo build that tries to just score like 4 points or 8 points in one turn is viable. I think it's too inconsistent to actually be up here this high on the tier list. I think you're better off just playing a normal aggro deck. All right, the next tier we have is B tier or tier 2. These are decks that are solid, can definitely top with good pilots, but don't expect to top big events if you're bringing these decks. These decks are perfectly fine for locals and they'll do just fine in that environment. But yeah, I think all these decks in this tier have clear weaknesses or shortcomings that really prevent them from being higher up on the list. So let's start off with Rek'Sai. This deck potentially could be higher up on this list. Getting units is really nice, but you do have to pay for them, so they're not free, but you're essentially just drawing cards for free, kind of, so it's kind of free. And when you hit Under Titan, sometimes you do just get units for completely free. Yeah, I think when this deck high rolls, it's extremely strong, but when it low rolls, obviously it's not gonna be that strong. It's the same with any gambling style of deck. You flip random cards, and if you hit the nuts, then you hit the nuts. I think both the heavy aggro builds and the more control builds with a bunch of removal spells and Phoenix both have their ups and downs. The removal build spends a ton of power potentially with Phoenix, and your removal spells like Falling Star, that's 3 power right there. That's a lot of power. Yeah, I think this deck could be better than this, which is why I put it at the top of this tier, but this deck seems pretty underrepresented, at least in China. Maybe it'll do better over here, but yeah, it really just hasn't done anything in China, so I do think it has potential to be better than this, but we'll see what happens. Your legend is pretty strong, I'd say, and your signature spell is also very good. Under Titan is crazy when you hit it, especially early on in the game. You can just win sometimes. Both of your champion units are also very strong, so you've got a really nice package to work with, but yeah, just not many people playing this. All right, next we have Azir. This deck I think is pretty good. I think it's got consistency issues, definitely. If you don't see your equipment, you kind of just don't do anything, and if you see too much of your equipment, you just can't really back up any of your plays. Sometimes you kind of have to hit your power cards in the late game, specifically Arise, your champion spell. Yeah, when I see this deck play, I'm just not that impressed by its performance. It tends to eat its runes a lot as well, because when your sand soldiers die, you have equipment, so you've got to equip them again, and that costs power to do, unless you have weapon masters like your Arise. Yeah, I don't think this deck is bad at all, but I also am not that impressed with it. Next up is Set. I think this deck is okay, potentially an underexplored deck. There's a bunch of different stuff you might be able to do with this, and you have punch first now, but I really don't think you're going to be playing that card in this deck because of how much power you're eating, just with playing the game in general and your legend. This deck has always been pretty power hungry, and that card really doesn't help, and it's kind of the best card that this color combo got this set, so not really being able to utilize that kind of feels bad. But you do have Camel, and if you buff Camel, they have to kill it twice, which is really annoying. Yeah, I don't know, maybe there's something with this deck, this format, but yeah, I just think you're gonna be really power hungry unless you build the deck in a specific way, that you like don't really spend power until like turn 3 or 4, and even after that you really can't spend that much power or else you're just gonna kill your runes. Next up is MF, specifically the Aurora build. I think this deck is kind of falling out of favor. The existence of purple all over the format means that your big big guys are going to get answered by pretty cheap cards. All the top decks also have really nice answers to Aurora itself, and the existence of Victor in the format is just going to make you cry. But you do get a more consistent access to Aurora this format because you have Called Shot. You can dig deeper into your deck than you were able to before more consistently. So I don't think it's that bad of a deck, but yeah, it is just kind of Outlast now. Too many ways to deal with your threats, too many decks that can go decently fast. Yeah, I just don't really think this is a great deck to be picking right now, but it's not that bad. You'll probably have a good time against anything else in your tier and below with this deck, but trying to reach up into the upper tiers, I don't really know how well that's going to work out. Next up, we've got Jax, which is a very interesting deck. I also think this deck is pretty underexplored right now. He's really not that great. He gets free equip costs and he gets to trigger targeting and equip effects as well, so I think his legend is pretty decent. His champions are alright as well, and his signature spell is pretty good. He's all around just a solid mid-range deck, I would say, but there are other mid-range decks in the upper tiers that just do what he does, but much better. And he is kind of in the same boat. I think he just gets outclassed this format. Yeah, Punch First is an excellent card, but you really feel the disparity in card draw with this deck. You really don't get to draw that many cards with this deck, and you look at Draven with his like 5 to 6 free cards every game against you, and you just say, well, I can't really deal with that. Yeah, having Camel is nice as your top end is pretty good, but you have to put it on a battlefield. Would you play it if you just played in base and past? That's super slow and it's not going to help you. And even then, if you can't back it up with pump spells, it's still probably going to die. Darius and Cleave hits 10 attack, and Camel naturally defends for 7 in this stack, so even with a pump spell, you don't save the Camel. You would specifically need Punch First. Yeah, I don't know. This is just another mid-range deck that kind of gets out mid-ranged by the other mid-range decks in the higher tiers. How many times can I say mid-range this video? At the top end that you would play that was previously very strong, like Dead Bloom and White Flame, are really just not worth playing anymore, I'd say. They're very expensive. Dead Bloom, yeah, it has deflect, but it still gets pushed back or bounced back to hand by purple, which just feels really bad. You basically just waste a whole turn. Yeah, I think this deck is another fine deck that's just solid, but is gonna get outclassed by some of the stuff above it. It's kind of the same boat with the last two decks in this tier, Teemo and Yasuo. Teemo, you do get switcheroo with this deck, which is kind of crazy. There could be potential for this guy to move up into the tier above. I think he's actually pretty good. It's just that like nobody is playing him. He gets switcheroo this set, which is an insane card in this deck. 1 energy to just win a combat is cracked. He also gets the purple Ezreal and Rosso shenanigans that you can do. He already wanted to discard cards for Mundo, and now you have better and faster ways of doing that. So this deck could potentially actually be pretty good and pretty scary, but just nobody is experimenting with him. Nobody's optimizing him. I do think there is potential for him to move upwards into a higher tier though. Him and Rek'Sai, I think, would be the best decks in this tier to experiment with pushing into the upper echelons of competitive play. Next, we've got Yasuo, which also kind of got a boost from purple Ezreal because he was sort of already doing that, discard a bunch of cards and draw with Scrap Heap and play Rosso shenanigans last format. So that just gets better. He gets access to Stellacorn and Green Aurelia, which you can mess around playing with as well. Those cards are very strong. But yeah, his legend, I think, is just a little bit expensive unless you're specifically playing on Targons and you can mitigate the cost. I think it's a fine deck, but I think Draven can just do pretty much everything he can do, but better if you're building him to be a more mid-range deck or even a more combo-y turbo discard deck. And if you want a deck in this color combo, you have Aurelia, which is just better. I don't know, you can experiment with this deck as well. Maybe it could potentially rise up to a higher tier, but I don't know. Like, nobody's playing this deck. All right, now we've got, of course, our rogue decks are unexpected picks. Unexpected because it's probably unexpected if these actually manage to top an event. They're not that bad of decks, but they have clear weaknesses and they really don't have that many strengths. They're either trying to do something that fundamentally doesn't really work, either this format or in general, or just have better versions of themselves up in the higher tiers. They're not the worst though. You can definitely still bring them to locals and do decently. But yeah, I would not expect any of these decks to actually be able to top a regional. If one of them manages to sneak in, it's unexpected, but not out of the question. I think any of these decks could sneak a top spot into the top cut of a regional, but I would not expect them to do so, and I would not not go into the regional expecting to top with these decks. First is Ornn. Fundamentally, I just don't think his playstyle really works right now, especially with purple and with red being the top decks. If your opponent resolves a Thermal Beam against you, it is basically just GG. You're heavily over-reliant on playing a bunch of gear and playing a single unit or 2 units to equip those gear onto. It's a very all-in Voltron style of deck that I think fundamentally just doesn't really work in this game unless something really crazy comes out that makes it work. But yeah, trying to equip a ton of gear onto one unit, I really don't know if that playstyle is going to work. Aurelia works because she can actually do more than just that and back up her plays with pump spells and stuff. Ornn really doesn't have the deck space for that. You're pigeonholed into playing a bunch of equipment, or else your legend and your chosen champ really don't do anything. And I would say that the equipment we have right now, at least in these colors, just is not enough to make him a viable strategy, besides like GA. That's like the only good one. Yeah, Ornn, too all in, too linear. I think in this format, it just doesn't really work. Darius, his color combo doesn't really draw cards well. He has a card draw problem. He's always had a card draw problem. His legend effect, like, sometimes gives him 1 more energy, which is like, okay. Annie always gives me 2 energy for free, so that's double the effectiveness and I don't even have to do anything. And if you're playing the Hook build, it's kind of just high roll. If you see Hook early, the deck is good. If you don't, you've got all these cards in your hand that you want to hit off Hook that you don't really want in your hand, which is really not an amazing way to build a deck in this game. I want the cards in my hand to be cards that I actually want in my hand. The deck is built in such a way that you don't want a lot of the cards in it in your hand, you want them in your deck to hit off of Hook. So I think we're gonna need a searcher for Hook that you can play like turn 1 or 2 to really make this deck consistent enough. Either that or more stuff you can do that's viable besides just Hook. Next is Ahri, and it's a mid-range deck, again, that is just kind of outclassed in this format. She is a very defensive deck and wants to just sit on battlefields, but that's pretty hard to do in this format with stuff like Draven and Aurelia, and even all the control decks running around blowing up your units. Yeah, you can protect them with your green stuff, but if they actually manage to kill a unit or 2, that's really gonna hurt. Your legend effect is fine. There's a lot of times in the format where just 1 unit is gonna be attacking you, and in that case, you'd rather just be Yi. Your chosen champs are fine. Green Ahri is just way too bad rate-wise. 4 might for 5 into power is just awful, but until you can actually hold with it, it's just a vanilla that does nothing, with terrible stats for its cost. And your signature spell really isn't that great. Especially with quick draw in the format, it can easily just do nothing the entire game. Leona, also a mid-range deck that is just outclassed. Her legend gives +1, and you have to work for it. Her champs are pretty good, but her spell is really expensive just to move something. This deck can be fine for local play, but I think you just get outstatted or outvalued or out-tempoed. This deck is kind of just a bit too slow, has not enough value generation in terms of like card advantage and stats on board and energy economy. Yeah, I think this deck is just the definition of mid at everything. And Rumble, this legend wants to hold, but holding sucks right now, so you're probably not going to be holding, so you're not really going to get the effect of this that much. So his legend is just kind of weak. +1 on defense is okay. It's pretty much the same as Ahri, which is also just okay. Your champion unit, the red one, is really good though. That's a pretty good unit, but your signature spell sucks. 1 into power for +1 is awful. Yeah, so while your mechs are pretty good cards, you really just don't have anything besides that. First Forerunner is like the best card in this deck, and everything else is kind of just lackluster. Alright, down into D tier, the weakest decks in the game. I think they would need significant help to be brought up into even a little bit of competitive status. These are decks that either fundamentally don't work or are just way too weak for what they're trying to do. Jinx just doesn't work. You want cards in your hand in this game, and Jinx says don't do that, which is just kind of antithetical to the game right now. Purple as a color wants a bunch of cards in hand, but Jinx doesn't want to do that. All of the good discard cards plus you when they discard, like Ezreal and Scrap Heap, so you don't get your legend effect. Yeah, basically, if you're putting good cards in your deck, you don't really have a legend, which is just not a good place to be. I think this playstyle of just discarding and turbo playing your hand out onto the board fundamentally just doesn't really work right now. Speaking of fundamentally not working, we have Renata. This deck wants to hold, and that doesn't happen in this format. You are simply not holding battlefields against Draven or Aurelia or even Ezreal in this color combo. Blue and yellow simply do not have the defensive tools necessary for this kind of deck to work. You have basically no way of protecting any of your units from stuff like damage spells or even attacks. All you can do is just try and kill their stuff when they attack in, and people have answers for that. So yeah, the only way I could see this deck working is if you just go all in on the second half of this card's effect and build this as like a combo deck that's trying to combo out some big explosive turn towards the end of the game, but you are completely sacrificing your early to mid game to be able to do that. Your opponent's probably going to be able to play the game and score points and stuff while you're not. It worked with Aurora last format because that was a good enough payoff, but I don't think you have a good enough payoff for this deck. And if you try to build this deck to hold at all, it's probably just not going to work. You can essentially ignore the first line of text on this card, this format. Also, a deck that just doesn't work is Volibear. Ramp could be viable, and it has been viable with Aurora before, but that's because a color combo of purple-orange was good enough to make it work. Even purple-green was pretty good, but purple-red just doesn't work. Red just does not provide anything you would want in this type of deck besides like Cadrigan, and that's like, okay. Yeah, we need a lot better red units and red utility stuff for this type of deck to be able to work. Lee Sin, a deck that just doesn't really do anything. You could play it as an Aurora deck, but there's just better options for that. You could play it as a Protect the Castle deck, but it's just really slow. This is probably the worst legend effect in the game that actually functions, because I'm counting Jinx, Renata, and Garen as just not functioning legend effects. So of the effects in this game that actually do something, this is probably the worst one. The pay 1 on it really sucks. If this was just tap and buff a friendly unit, it would be much better, but it's not. For some reason, it just has to be super overcosted for what it does. And then we get to Garen. This is just a vanilla. He doesn't have text. You don't need to read the card. Maybe one day they'll print something that makes him good, but until specifically that happens, he's just the worst deck in the game. All right, that's the list. Yeah, I actually think this format is pretty decently balanced. We've got in our top tier a mid-range deck, more control-heavy deck with Ezreal, and kind of a funky little Protect the President deck with Aurelia, and also a fast deck with Andy. So yeah, there's some decent variety in playstyles up here. I think this format is going to shape up to be pretty good. I really don't think Draven's going to over-dominate like he did the first two regionals. I think people have figured out ways to either contend with what he does or just straight up counter what he does with specific counters like control decks like Victor and Lux. I think there's a lot of different decks in this format that are pretty viable. I think you can really do well with anything in the top two tiers. I think all of them are good picks in this format, and maybe even some of them could sneak their way up from tier 1.5 up into tier 1, from high tier to top tier, and even the decks in tier 2 are still really good. I'd say you could bring them to a regional and potentially top. I definitely don't think you should be expecting to top if you bring these decks, but they're still fine picks. Yeah, some decks I'm potentially underestimating. Kai'Sa and Fiora might be able to move up into the top tier. Rek'Sai and Teemo, I would like to see some experimentation with. They could maybe move up into high tier, tier 1.5. Everything else is probably a pretty solid placement. Maybe a couple of these decks throughout this list might not be as good as I put them on here, but I think this is a pretty good estimate of the power level of these decks in this format. So let me know what you guys think, what decks you think I've overrated, what decks you think I've underrated, and let me know what you're excited to play in this format. I'm going to be on Draven and winning everything. Let's go.